All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Salt Lake City's Facebook Ask Me Anything on fair housing. Captions are provided via the Facebook live stream, and you can toggle those on and off using the closed caption button in Facebook. My name is Ashley Lickley, and I am the Salt Lake City ADA coordinator. I'll be helping to moderate today's AMA. We have an excellent group of panelists joining us today to help inform this conversation about the Fair Housing Act and federal and local protections afforded to renters and homeowners, not just in Salt Lake City, but statewide. Joining us today are Bard McGuire, Fair Housing Testing Coordinator at the Disability Law Center, Chris Vogel, Program Compliance Branch Chief with U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Sam Ball, Design Associate with Assist, and Karen Clough, Case Management Supervisor with the First Step House. We'll hear from the panelists in just a moment, but again, I want to thank everyone for joining us on Facebook. We're scheduled for an hour and we'll go until noon. We definitely want to hear from you during this conversation, so please feel free to add your questions to the chat. Our intention for this AMA is to provide information about fair housing protections, what to do if you or someone you know has experienced discrimination in housing, and make you aware of local resources that can help. During this AMA, we will be sharing links to the city's website on fair housing and to local resources. And tomorrow, Salt Lake City Mayor Erin Mendenhall will hold a press event to announce her proclamation recognizing April as Fair Housing Month. The mayor supports the renewed federal energy to uphold and strengthen the Fair Housing Act. April is also Community Development Month, and Mayor Mendenhall recognizes Congress's effort to put more funding into community development programs that can increase accessibility. We have agencies with us that improve equity and accessibility every day, and we're excited to hear about the amazing work they do and the services they offer. We want to make sure that this is as informative as possible, so don't forget to put any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. We're going to start off with Bard McGuire. Bard, can you start with frequently asked questions for the Disability Law Center and then jump into the services that the DLC provides?
Sure, thanks, Ashley. So actually, but before I get into the DLC services, I want to give a quick introduction to the Fair Housing Act because I'm up first, and I think it kind of sets the stage for a lot of what we're going to be talking about. And so the Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968, and its purpose is to protect people from discrimination in housing situations. And so the people that the Fair Housing Act protects are what we call protected classes. And so those are different groups of people who shouldn't be targeted for harassment or discrimination. So there are 7 protected classes in the Fair Housing Act, and those are race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. And today we're mostly going to be focused on disability and accessibility specifically. And then also another law that is going to come into play is the Utah Fair Housing Act. And so in the Utah Fair Housing Act, there are 3 more protected classes. And so here in Utah, we have source of income as a protected class, as well as gender identity and sexual orientation. And then the Fair Housing Act applies to generally sales, lending, and rentals. At the DLC, we deal pretty much only in rentals, but there are a lot of different entities out there who are required to comply with the Fair Housing Act. So like banks and lenders, real estate brokers, owners, private landlords, property management companies, homeowners associations, jurisdictions like cities and towns. So developers, architects. It also applies to lots of different types of housing, It's like rentals, as well as emergency shelters, student housing, senior centers, senior retirement communities. So there's lots of different types of housing that the Fair Housing Act covers. So like I said, we deal with it primarily in the rental area at the Disability Law Center. And so at the Disability Law Center, so my title is a Fair Housing Testing Coordinator, and I'll maybe talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And so the Disability Law Center has a grant from HUD to do fair housing work here in Utah. And so even though we're at the Disability Law Center, the Fair Housing Program, we actually serve all of those protected classes, but not just disability. We cover the whole state of Utah, and we don't charge for our services. And so the Fair Housing Program at the DLC does three things. So the first one is we enforce the Fair Housing Act. And so if somebody feels like they have experienced discrimination in housing, then they can call us. And so how that might look would be, it would depend on their situation, but we might give people information about how to resolve a situation on their own. We might have our attorneys maybe mediate with a landlord for an accommodation, or we might file complaints with HUD or the state alleging discrimination against landlords. We also do fair housing testing, which I mentioned. And so fair housing testing is like secret shopper, but with apartments and discrimination. And so I have a number of people who have been trained as testers for me who will call on properties, and then I monitor those conversations for signs of discrimination. And if we see something going on, then we'll file a complaint. And then we also do education and outreach. And so a little bit more about what we do at the DLC. Obviously we have a big focus on disability, and that's why we're here today, and accessibility. So people with disability under the Fair Housing Acts have some additional protections that those other protected classes don't. And so there are some design and construction requirements, and I think Chris is going to talk about that. So new housing should be built in an accessible way. And then the other two rights that people with disabilities have are the right to ask for reasonable accommodations in housing and reasonable modifications in housing. And so an accommodation is like an exception to a rule or a policy for something that someone who has a disability needs to be able to live where they're living. And so like in a rental situation, an example of an accommodation would maybe be an apartment complex that has a parking lot, but they have a policy that they don't assign parking spaces. So maybe there's a person with a disability living there who has a mobility impairment, and it's hard for them to try to find a space and walk, a distance to get to their unit. So they could go to the management and say, hey, I know your policy is that you don't assign parking, but I have a disability and I need a parking spot, so can you assign me a spot? So that's an example of an accommodation. Modifications are more along the lines of physical or structural adjustments to the premises. Sam, I think, is probably going to maybe talk a little bit more about modifications, but like installing grab bars in a bathroom for someone who needs them to use a shower or tub. So those are accommodations and modifications.
Bart, I have a question. You talked a little bit about what accommodations and modifications are. What does someone have to do to get an accommodation or a modification?
Yeah, so first of all, when we're talking about accommodations and modifications, there has to be someone who has a disability in the household. So these are kind of rights that are only afforded to disability as a protected class and not the others. So there's someone who has a disability, and then there needs to be an ask. So there should be a conversation with the management or the owner. Even though people have this right, they shouldn't just assume it's okay to go ahead and start making changes. There should be a conversation with the landlord. So that conversation, we Usually always suggest that people put it in writing just to document that it happened. It can be a verbal conversation, but still putting something in writing and giving that to the landlord is a good idea. But that ask can really kind of be as simple as, I have a disability, this is what your policy is, and this is what I need. So can you please give that to me? That ask can come from the person. It can also be made by a family member or someone else on their behalf. Like, I have a sister who has a disability, and I've made a number of accommodation requests on her behalf. Yeah, so that's kind of how the process works. And if people need help with that process, we have fact sheets and can kind of give people some assistance to walk through that process.
Great, thank you for answering that. Do accommodations only apply to rental situations?
No, so accommodations can apply to a lot of other situations as well. I have a couple of examples. So, I mentioned emergency shelters are covered by the Fair Housing Act. So if there's someone who's living in a domestic violence shelter or a homeless shelter and have a disability and they need an accommodation or modification, usually accommodation, they can ask for those in those situations. Accommodations will also apply to situations where there's like a homeowners association. So maybe somebody owns a condo or lives in a community with a homeowners association. And maybe the homeowners association has a rule against something that the person might need because of their disability. So someone can go to their HOA and again, say, have that conversation, I need this, can you please make that exception? And then also the Fair Housing Act, like I said, and accommodations also apply to jurisdictions like cities and towns. So maybe there is a zoning ordinance that's getting in the way of a person with a disability and what they need where they're living, right? And so they can make an accommodation request with the city. And a couple of examples of that, like we had one here at our house. We needed to build a fence that was kind of outside of usual code. And so we went through the process with Salt Lake City of asking for an accommodation to have this specific type of fence that didn't meet code. And another, sometimes you'll see with jurisdictions, there will be maybe an ordinance that will say something along the lines of, there can only be X number of people who are not related living together. And so that would have an effect on places like group homes or treatment centers, where there are groups of people with disabilities living together, and they're obviously not related. And so we've also had a number of cases where we've helped to ask for accommodations in situations like that.
Great, thank you for that. One accommodation or modification might be an assistance animal. Could you describe the difference between a service animal and an assistance animal?
Yeah, sure. And this is usually our biggest question, like wherever I go, assistance animals. So the difference between a service animal and a therapy animal. So a service animal is like the technical term that's coming from the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the ADA, and that applies to public places. Service animals, again, for public places are typically dogs, and they're required to be trained to perform a specific task for that person with a disability. So, like maybe somebody who's blind has a dog that guides them, right? That's a specific task. Or somebody's in a wheelchair and they have a dog that's been trained to go retrieve things for them or pick things up for them. Assistance animal is more of the technical term under the Fair Housing Act. It's also kind of more of like an umbrella term. And so it can include a service animal if somebody has a service animal where they're living, but it would also include other types of animals you might hear about, like therapy animal that you mentioned, or emotional support animal. And so again, these are for housing situations. They're not required to have a specialized task. So, if somebody has anxiety, like you kind of don't train a dog to alleviate anxiety. it just kind of happens. So there's no training there, right? So that's kind of there with assistance animals. And then also the type of animal can really depend on the situation. So it can be a dog, but somebody could have a cat, or we've had clients with lots of different types of animals in lots of different situations that we've helped them to ask for accommodations for.
Great. Thank you so much, Bard. I could ask you questions all day. There's so many other questions I want to ask, but we're going to move forward to our next person. We're going to hear from Sam Ball next. Sam, can you start off with frequently asked questions for Assist and then jump into some of the services that Assist provides?
Yeah, I think to start off just real quick, I wanted to give a quick introduction of who Assist is and what we do and what our organization is, because I think we feel kind of a very unique need in the community, and sometimes individuals aren't very aware of our services. So Assist, we're a nonprofit community design center and licensed architecture firm that was founded by a partnership between the University of Utah School of Architecture and AIA Utah. And we were founded back in 1969. And ever since the beginning, we've been focused on strengthening neighborhoods and helping residents of our county remain in their homes through our emergency home repair and accessibility design assistance and community design programs. And we do this we strategically use Cdbg funding to assist lower income homeowners or families with the design or the repair and the costs that come with designing and repairing or modifying their homes to better meet their physical needs, right? And we feel our programs, provide a sense of dignity and independence, not only for those with physical disabilities, but those who are also kind of aging in their homes and are in need of kind of modification so that they can continue to live in the communities that they've invested so much time throughout their lives in. Yeah, we feel that, that's how we really strengthen communities, is by helping individuals stay in their home for as long as they can, which is for most individuals is their preferred living environment, right? Most individuals would like to prefer to stay in their home that they've been in for who knows how long. And our programs assist individuals in doing that.
Thanks for that introduction to Assist. You used an acronym, CDBG. Can you tell what that is?
Yeah. So CDBG is a community development block grant funding, and it comes down from the federal government and then is administered by local municipalities or local counties. And the intention of it is to reinvest in the community and reinvest, take tax funding and use that to reinvest and benefit our local communities on a very local level. And we're lucky enough to have some municipalities and counties here in the area that fund our programs and allow us to really use that special funding to help communities remain strong by helping community members stay in their communities.
Awesome. Thanks for that explanation. Okay, so tell us more about the services that are available to someone who's aging into their residence and might need some sort of disability modifications.
Yeah. So I mentioned this a little bit in our intro, but what our services really include, a couple of different things. We have an emergency home repair program that helps primarily helps individuals with critical home repairs in their home that might threaten their housing stability. So that could be anything from furnace repairs, water heater repairs, a leaky roof, or it could be other types of kind of significant electrical or plumbing repairs that are needed so that they can continue to live in their homes safely, right? So that's our emergency home repair program that we offer to individuals. We also offer what we call our accessibility design program, and that assists individuals with the design and the construction costs that are associated with modifying their homes so that they can continue to live in their homes even as they age and they experience varying levels of maybe reduced mobility or other types of needs that they come across as they age. And those are kind of our primary services that are offered to individuals through our program.
Awesome, thank you. So what are households typically coming to assist with in terms of needing rehabilitation?
Yeah, so unfortunately, most residential construction, especially historic residential construction, doesn't really consider accessibility when it's being built. And so most households residing in that reside in single family residences are in need of some sort of accessibility design. But most of our clients are senior citizens who are on fixed incomes, or are possibly individuals who are experiencing a disability in their life. And so our modifications for these types of individuals, they range anywhere from it could be as simple as installing a grab bar in a bathtub, or installing a grab bar next to a toilet, or installing a handrail on a staircase, on an entry stair, or possibly a staircase that there was no handrail previously, right? And then it ranges all the way up to we find that entries in and out of homes are significant obstacles for individuals with a disability or reduced mobility. And so we can come in and we can modify stairs so that they're lower than what is typically allowed by code. And we call those low-rise steps. Or we can come in and design kind of an entry ramp on the front of the home to allow individuals who are in need of access in and out of their home with a wheelchair. Then we also do, we can do anything from door widenings on the inside of homes. Most doors inside homes are not designed for wheelchair access. So we can come in and widen specific doorways into bedrooms or into kind of critical areas of the home, such as bathrooms or kitchens. And then we also find that bathrooms are a significant obstacle for anybody who has reduced mobility or is using a wheelchair. And so our modifications in bathrooms often include, removing a bathtub and replacing it with a walk-in shower or a roll-in shower, and then, replacing a vanity with a roll-under vanity so that somebody can, who's using a wheelchair can wash their hands effectively and get ready for the day effectively. Or replacing, it could be something as basic as replacing a very generic toilet with something that's called an ADA toilet, or a comfort height toilet, which is a little bit taller for individuals so that it's a little more comfortable. And then, in some instances where an individual qualifies and we have the funding available, we do come in and do almost kind of full residence retrofits on some homes, or at least the design for those retrofits. And that can include the installation of a platform lift to get individuals to differing levels in a home, or it could also be, kitchen retrofits, which kitchens are also not generally accessible in most residential homes. And so those are kind of a variety of, that's most of the services that we offer, the modifications that households are requesting.
Thank you so much for that information. Y'all really do a lot. That's so great. Okay, last question I have for you is, are there any other equity concerns and best practices that Assist covers?
Yeah, so our organization, we do our best to assist homeowners, in the areas that we can assist them. But unfortunately, our programs are mainly only used for homeowners, right? To help homeowners, individuals who actually own the home that they're residing in. Our assistance is very limited on what we can offer to renters who are renting the household. And that's just because, there's various obstacles, whether that be the landlord or, the cost of the project gets significantly difficult. So, one concern is that our services are limited to renters. And so there may be a gap there where renters are unable to modify their place of residence until they actually own a home. And then when you couple that with kind of the affordable housing crisis that we're all experiencing at this time, it may be very, very difficult for somebody to find an affordable home that is also accessible and that can be modified to meet their needs. And that's just because, fair housing kind of rules and regulations and the accessibility that comes along with that is really only enforced upon multi-unit housing developments that are, 4 units or greater typically. And so anything under that, which is actually a significant portion of our housing stock, any single family residence or any, even townhomes or duplexes, none of those even took into account accessibility when they were initially designed or constructed. And so you're looking at a significant amount of our, affordable housing stock or existing housing stock that is not accessible, and then therefore forces, individuals into very, very difficult situations when they're trying to decide where they're going to live.
Absolutely. I think that we could probably talk about that topic all day.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam.
think-
Next, we're going to hear from Chris Vogel. Chris, can you start off with frequently asked questions for HUD and then jump into services that HUD provides?
Sure. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks for everybody for having us, the city for hosting this. Frequently asked questions. I mean, I guess the most obvious is like, what do you guys do? A lot of the people that we're here presenting with work with our office quite frequently, but as my description here at the bottom says, I'm with FHEO, which is the Office of Fair Housing Equal Opportunity here in Region 8. So my office covers the states of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. It's the Rocky Mountain region. And so we handle all of the federal fair housing regulations and also the grantee programs that deal with the civil rights components of those funding programs within those states. So what my office does is basically 3 things. We intake new complaints from the outside, which basically, people call in with the issue. So in the context of this discussion, people would call in saying that, I move into this new complex and it's not designed to meet my accessibility needs. So we'll take a look at those complaints, see if we can resolve them with the housing providers, and then make it more accessible. The other things that we do are the investigations of those complaints that come in. And then also my particular branch deals with compliance. So we deal with all the federal grantees within our states and make sure that they are providing housing and access to the programs for people with disabilities, and also making sure they comply with the other access with regard to the other protected classes beyond just disability. We're located here in Denver. I think it's a lot of questions, but we do have an outstation staff member in Utah, Michelle Hutchins. A lot of people know her there. She is one of the national experts with regard to accessibility and UFIS standards, and also the design and construction standards under the Act. It's a very complex area, as all the panelists here can tell you. It gets down to like inches, literally. I think it's important to note that an inch can literally make or break somebody's housing experience. So when designing or at least modifying, especially rental housing and things like that, and also private housing too, it's important to know that, those inches make all the difference to some people. So designing in accordance and with the mindfulness of accessibility can really make it open to a lot wider group of people.
Great. Thanks for that explanation, Chris. So one question I have for you is, what services do you want the community to be aware of, either through recently passed legislation or existing rights?
Sure. Good question. What I would want people to know is that we are available for both housing providers and also the public at large, the tenants, the renters, the home buyers. We are a neutral agency here to serve everybody that's paying taxes. That's what the federal government does. So we are here to enforce the laws and make sure there's compliance. But we'd also like to resolve issues and address and inform the public and also housing providers of the rights and responsibilities there too before these problems arise. So what I would say is that the tenants and people seeking housing, whether that be through purchase or rental, they have rights under the Fair Housing Act and other statutes that we can further talk about. But also we are available for the housing providers as well to answer questions, take you through technical assistance. We have architects in our office that can assist with these questions. I think it's important to know that when people are designing, constructing new housing, The city approval offices, they don't have the responsibility of ensuring that they're complying with the design and construction standards of the act. So there are agencies that do that separately. I'm not sure if Assist does or DLC, but a lot of these agencies can help you with specifically looking at your plans, looking at the contractors to make sure that these entities are designing and constructing these buildings in accordance with the law. There are seven main requirements under the act that I will kind of just run through very briefly here. These are very broad, and we actually have online a handbook. And this is for housing that was built after March 13th, 1991 for first occupancy. And these main requirements are accessible building entrance on an accessible route, accessible and usable public and common use areas, usable doors, accessible route in through a covered unit, accessible light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other things like environmental controls, reinforced walls for grab bars. You mostly see that in showers, and then also usable cabinets or usable kitchens and bathrooms. Again, these 7 requirements are covered in a 334-page manual that I would even say is not specific enough. So it's important to call when you have these questions. We can help navigate you. There's the Access Board at DC we can put you in contact with. And there's also an organization called Accessibility First. I think they're out of Indianapolis, but it's a free website. It's a nonprofit set up. You can go to their website. I think it's accessibilityfirst.org. They have people on staff that can answer a lot of questions. So when in doubt, I say call us. I don't think we've ever fielded a question from somebody like a housing provider, and then we filed a case against them because they called us. That's usually not how it works. Usually the problems come after the fact, after you don't call us, and then you take a chance on something, and then it winds up filing into a complaint. So I would say contact us if you're ever in doubt of any questions.
Thanks for that explanation. Okay, I feel like you've probably touched on this a little bit, but I want to just ask and see if you have more to say in regards to this. How is HUD involved in fair housing?
Right, yeah, so I did touch on that mainly. So my office, the Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Office, is one of the many enforcement agencies. It's on the federal level, of course, that enforce the Fair Housing Act. We do that in conjunction with our FIT partners like BARD and the Disability Law Center. And then also our FAP agencies like the UALD there in Utah. They get funding through us to help investigate complaints that arise in Utah. Sometimes the complaints that come from Utah stay with my office. Sometimes they're investigated by Utah, depending on what the situation is. For the most part, we investigate complaints and then also assist with technical assistance with our housing providers and also our federal grantees. These are the housing providers that get HUD money to put on certain low-income programs. We assist them with navigating the issues when it comes to fair housing, whether that be through how they're advertising their properties to certain groups of people, or how, like we were talking about here, how they're actually building these facilities for different groups of people, including those with disabilities. And that's mainly what we do. We wear a lot of hats. We also not only help the public at large and then private corporations or housing providers throughout the states. We also help the offices within HUD that also have to deal with these agencies too. So a lot of the housing providers deal with our Office of Multifamily or CPD that does the Cdbg program. They are not experts in fair housing either. So we rely on each other, just as we're not experts in how the grant programs actually work and function in practice. We ask them, they ask us these questions, and we try to maintain open flow of communication. It's not something that's intuitive with the government, but we try to do it as best we can. And I say we do a pretty good job here in Region 8.
Thanks for that response. I do have one more question for you. What are some common design and construction issues you're currently seeing in your work?
Good question. So I would say recently, I recently moved over. I was formerly the enforcement branch chief, so I did a lot of the investigations. Throughout the past few years, I would say the primary issue that we're seeing is, well, there's a couple. One is the exterior balconies. There are a lot of problems with the threshold to those balconies. And what we're talking about is like sliding door balconies. A lot of times, I'm not I'm not an engineer and architect by nature, but the mechanisms that hold the door in place on the bottom, those thresholds are too high. And there's specific requirements. If there's drainage on those decks, there's like something called Trex decking, which is like a composite material that takes the place of wooden boards. But if there's drainage in between, then you can have a certain height. And if there's not, you can have to have a lower height. It all depends on like the snow buildup, and which is specifically important in this region. That is a common area that we're seeing, and it basically prevents persons who have mobility disabilities, people in wheelchairs, from getting on the balcony. So it's really restricting like a big selling point of a lot of these properties is like their views. And if somebody can't use the balcony, it really restricts their equal use and enjoyment of the property. Another thing is somewhat in the same vein, it's the common use areas. There's a lot of confusion around how pools and spas and hot tubs are set up in privately owned rental facilities, and then those that are in place in something like a hotel where it's a kind of public accommodation. We see a lot of times housing providers want to build these very ornate, fancy pools that are kind of lifted above the ground, and they put in, well-meaning enough, they put in chair lifts, which are more ADA and required for hotel settings, but they're not specifically required for rental settings. So what happens is there's a conflict between the building and design for rental settings, which don't cover some of the things that ADA specifically requires. So there's a well-meaning design that has a chair, yet it doesn't really serve the purpose, and there's often complications with that design. All that to say is that there's a lot of new public or common use areas that are becoming more in vogue and in trend that we really haven't worked through the potential design problems yet. So I would say if you're a housing provider and you're looking to design something kind of new, you may want to ask our office first, what are the potential problems that can be foreseen? One other one is like rooftop decks. A lot of times those are a big selling point, especially somewhere here like in Denver or in Salt Lake City where you want mountain views. However, if somebody has a mobility impairment, they can't navigate stairs. So a lot of times they're relying on elevators to reach those points of access. And without an elevator, it's a amenity of the complex that is just not available to them. So those are the common things that we're seeing.
Thank you for that. You raise a lot of really good points. I look forward to learning more. Okay. Next, we're going to hear from Karen Clough with First Step House. So Karen, can you start off with frequently asked questions and then jump into the services that you provide?
Yes, so as the case management supervisor at First Step House, we are most well known for our substance use disorder treatment. We primarily serve men, although this year we are expanding those services to serve women in an outpatient setting in substance use treatment disorder as well. I'm a social worker that has been in Salt Lake City for the last 15 years, primarily working with people that are homeless or at risk of homeless, help connecting them to housing, and serving people that have substance use disorder and co-occurring mental health. At First Step House, with our treatment services the last few years, we've also delved quite a bit into housing. So even with our case management services, we provide holistic case management to the people that are in our substance use treatment programs, working very closely with them to help them find housing. So when they complete their treatment, they aren't returning to homelessness or at-risk situations. And then we also are subcontracted through different housing agencies to provide direct services to people in housing. So we work with Housing Connect and the City Housing Authority and the Road Home to provide case management services at scattered sites with people that are living in the community on subsidized housing vouchers. We also provide the services at Valor House, which is a veterans program, and that's in conjunction with the VA and the City Housing Authority to provide those case management and treatment services to veterans in that housing program. And then in the last 2 years, throughout the pandemic, actually, we opened 2 subsidized housing buildings, Central City Apartments, and then Medina Place Apartments. And those are subsidized housing buildings for people with disabilities. And so, yeah, we've grown a lot, and we're providing a lot of direct services to people that are most in need in our community.
Great. Thank you, Karen, for that. You just mentioned those 2 new project-based housing developments that you've done in the last 2 years. Can you talk about some of the accessibility modifications with that?
Yeah, and designing those projects, because we were working with, those in our community that are that have disabilities, we really focused on that in mind in developing and building those projects. So they were designed from kind of a trauma-informed care down to the, colors and designs. And then we also have accessible units. There are 2 units on each of the floors, really paying mind, to the roll-in showers and having the lower counters, flashing doorbells for those that are sight impaired, and making sure that you're meeting those requirements for accessible units in the building. They have elevators, and making sure you're meeting all those requirements for people that are in need in housing.
That's great to take universal design and trauma-informed design. That is really great, Karen. So that's with all the new construction and building that y'all have done. What about how does First Step House go about ensuring clients who need their accessibility needs met are given adequate accommodations kind of beyond the scope of the new projects?
Yeah, so in working with clients that are in housing, particularly with the subsidized housing vouchers, they're scattered site throughout the community as renters. We do a lot of work in helping those clients access and file reasonable accommodations with their landlords, and advocating for themselves for seeking housing. I do a housing presentation. A lot of that comes with education of letting them know what fair housing is, what rights are protected, what they have a right to as far as a renter, and accessing units and accessing fair housing. So we have that education piece. And then we utilize sites like the Disability Law Center, using some of their templates to be able to request these reasonable accommodations when they need them from their landlords. I would say the ESA, or the emotional support animals, are one of the biggest ones we do. That's very common. Also requesting, to have accessible units. Sometimes people develop disabilities that make it harder for them to access units that they have already been in. So then kind of requesting those accommodations in a reasonable and timely manner, like moving to a ground floor unit if they become or if they have mobility issues that develop. So having those accommodations requested from their landlords. So mostly education and just assisting people to utilize their rights and get those accommodations that they need.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Okay, thank you to all the panelists for all the information that you've provided so far. And now we're going to spend the rest of the time answering questions from the chat. So if you are listening in and haven't sent any questions yet, feel free to do that now. And I actually do want to jump back to a question for Vard. You mentioned source of income as one of the protections here in Utah. Are Section 8 holders protected from housing discrimination?
Yeah, so source of income, like I said, is a protection here in Utah. And with source of income, that relates to like how somebody is going to be paying for their housing or where they're living. So that's going to include a couple things. It can include like cash benefits that somebody might be receiving. So there could be a landlord out there who maybe wants somebody who has a job to be renting from them. But if there's someone who is receiving Social Security and they could afford to live there, like they shouldn't be denied that opportunity because they're not working. So that's one example. But then, like you mentioned, housing vouchers are a really big one. So source of income protects people who have housing vouchers. So here in Utah, if the housing is covered, landlords should be taking housing vouchers. And so that could mean Section 8 or housing choice. But there are lots of other vouchers out there that would also apply, like a VASH or rapid rehousing or HOPWA. There are lots of acronyms for vouchers. And so, yeah, landlords should be taking those here. And it's a really important one for people with disabilities because like many voucher holders have disabilities. So that's one that there's a really strong intersection with disability. And then I think like one last piece, we also hear occasionally where a landlord will accept a voucher, but then they'll also treat those voucher holders differently than other tenants. And so we shouldn't be seeing that. We'll have tenants, living on a property with a voucher, and they'll be told things like, well, you're not paying your own rent, so I'm not going to make repairs to your apartment, or you're on a voucher, so you don't have access to these things, but everybody else here does. So that also shouldn't be happening.
Great, thank you for that answer. I have another question I think you can answer as well. Sherry on Facebook asks, do you have to be deemed disabled by the Social Security office to qualify as disabled?
No, and that's a really great question. So the definition of disability under the Fair Housing Act, and it's going to be similar for a lot of other laws like the ADA, but basically says, somebody has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. So like seeing or breathing or walking or taking care of oneself, as well as a couple other parts to the definition. But if you fit that definition, you fit that definition under the Fair Housing Act. So you don't have to be like certified disabled or be receiving Social Security to be able to ask for accommodations or modifications and have these protections. If you fit that definition, that's good enough here. That's a really great question.
One piece with that is that if you typically still in asking for that accommodation do need some sort of certification from like a doctor, although it doesn't have to state right what your disability is, just that you have one. So you do typically need to be receiving services from a provider that can attest that you need that accommodation as part of your disability. So that is a piece where you kind of still need a bit of a tie-in for that usually, right?
Yeah, for the most part. And I didn't really talk about this, but yeah, this is kind of another important piece of that process. Like housing providers can ask for verification. So if you ask for an accommodation or a modification, they could potentially ask you to verify that you have a disability and a need. For obvious disabilities, so like if somebody's in a wheelchair and they ask for grab bars, or somebody is blind and they have a guide dog, those are obvious disabilities, and people with those types of disabilities shouldn't be made to jump through those extra hoops because you can see that they have the disability in the connection. But most disabilities aren't obvious. So yes, that's where verification comes in. So a housing provider can ask for that. Housing providers shouldn't be asking for like confidential information. Like we've seen housing providers trying to have people sign HIPAA releases so that they can call their doctors, and that's not good. But we also see a lot of times housing providers will say, I need a note from a doctor. And that's also kind of a misnomer. It doesn't have to be a medical doctor. It could be a medical doctor depending on the disability, but it doesn't have to be. For a mental illness, somebody might have a psychiatrist, which is a doctor, but they might have a psychologist or an LCSW, a therapist. So a therapist could provide verification. Somebody like Karen, who has probably had clients for years and understands their disability, like representing First Step House, like she could also provide verification. So that the verification doesn't have to be a doctor. Usually just somebody who's familiar with the person, and usually has some sort of credentials or could write it a letterhead, but not always. So.
Great. Thank you both for that answer. That was incredibly helpful. Okay, we have another question from the chat. Christiana on Facebook asks, what rights do tenants have related to eviction? And is it different for community members with disabilities?
You want me to start with that one again too? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of heading into a difficult and challenging area. Like we've been talking mostly about fair housing and fair housing laws, but there are also another set of laws called landlord-tenant laws. And landlord-tenant laws, especially here in Utah, favor landlords, I think, more than tenants. And so when it comes to disability, just because somebody has a disability, it doesn't give them special protection under landlord-tenant laws. I think where maybe the Fair Housing Act and evictions might kind of intersect with people with disabilities would be places like, the owner doesn't know you have a disability or a mental illness, and now they find out, and now they want to evict you. Or you need an assistance animal and they don't want that animal there, and so they evict you. So if you're being again, it's like this really gray area. And if your eviction is related to a disability specifically, there might be some connection, but otherwise there's not like a general protection. And I see Chris unmuting, and so I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, and just to your point, Bard, the federal government really doesn't have, when it comes to the specific eviction laws, landlord tenant, it is specifically state by state. We don't really involve ourselves in that, but there is that crossover that Vard mentioned when the eviction, if it's a normal eviction for like potentially not paying rent, you lose employment, something like that, it kind of falls outside the scope of fair housing. But there could be, like Bart said, a fair housing component when the eviction is potentially caused by one of the symptoms of the disability. So what we're talking, and that can be somewhat broad. I mean, there are cases out there, like specifically, like you mentioned, if there's like an assistance animal there that they have and they need it and they're prescribed for it, and that's the impetus for the eviction, there's like a fair housing defense to that eviction. And there's also situations where if somebody receives disability income, SSDI, sometimes the payments on those can become later in the month than the landlord has requested in, like, they normally 5 days, something like that, after the first of the month. You could request a reasonable accommodation for them to extend that date further into the month if your disability payments come later in the month. So there is potential for you to like ask a normal waiver to a provision that would normally get you evicted because of your disability. And therefore, if they evicted you on those grounds, you could have a fair housing defense to that eviction. That makes sense.
Really quickly too, there is a resource. The Utah Housing Coalition has a renter's toolkit that they publish. It's actually really easy to find online, even if you just look up like Utah Renters Toolkit. That goes over tenant rights and responsibilities and kind of just like helpful, tips and hints in getting along with your landlord or asking some of these things, and goes over what your rights are as a tenant. So if you're interested in learning more about that, that is a really great resource to have, is that renter's toolkit for learning what your rights are. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. That's a great resource. Okay, I have one more question for Vard, and then then we'll spend the last couple of minutes kind of wrapping up. So the last question, Vard, for you is, can a property refuse to rent to someone because they have children?
Yeah, okay. And Chris also might want to jump in on this one as well, because familial status, family status is a federal protection. And so with familial status, that means that there are children under the age of 18 in the household. And so that could be, two parents with kids, single parents with kids, expecting mothers or expecting families. It could also be situations where, you know, there's someone's looking to foster or adopt into the household, or maybe there's a grandparent who is now getting custody of their grandkids. So, you know, if they're under the age of 18, that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so so the short answer, I guess, like, no, you know, so like explicitly denying because a family has children is not a good thing. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have more to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Bard. I think where this does get a little tricky and what we've seen recently in cases, and maybe you guys had some cases too, I can't recall off the hand, but is when it becomes an occupancy issue. And let's say you have family of 8 and it's a 1-bedroom apartment. I mean, that is when there's a reasonableness standard comes in. Obviously, the presence of the 6 kids with this couple causes it to be like an unreasonable living standard in this particular unit. But, you know, we say that the general rule of thumb, there's no national occupancy standard, but the general rule of thumb is 2 people per bedroom. But that, you know, there exceptions can be made there when the rooms are massive or there's like a huge living room area or something like that. So it kind of comes down to a common sense standards, but in general, no, landlords should not deny somebody on the basis of children. A lot of times we see them steering families with children into certain buildings of units and things like that. That's also illegal and should not be done. But yeah, I would say when there is an occupancy question, please contact one of the agencies here. I mean, you can contact our office too, and we can help you navigate that question.
And with that occupancy, you know, like we've had clients who like maybe like a couple living in a 1-bedroom apartment, and as soon as they, you know, announce that they're having a baby, then the landlord will say, well, you guys need to move. And you know, like having a baby in a 1-bedroom apartment is probably like very reasonable, but immediately when there's a pregnancy announced or they have the child, they're told they have to find somewhere else to live. So yeah, it's not good.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is a reasonable standard, and you'd be surprised that some municipalities even have children up to the age of, you know, 2 years don't count towards that 2 people per room. So they've actually built in that reasonableness standard. But again, yeah, there's a presumption that, you know, it's the baby in the bassinet. It's in the bedroom with the parents. That's presumed reasonable in that situation.
Can I add one more thing to that also? So I think that there are also some situations where there might be mixed gender children in the household, and it really shouldn't be, I don't think, the landlord's decision about whether they're sharing a room or not. Like that should be the parents' the family's decision. And so, you know, there might be a situation where there's 2 parents, 2 kids, one's a boy, one's a girl, looking for a 2-bedroom apartment, and the landlord will say, no, I don't think that's appropriate for them to be sharing. Either you can't rent here or you need to rent a 3-bedroom apartment. So again, like, I think decisions like that should fall on the family and not the owners or landlords.
Yes, that is all very great information. Thank you both for answering that question. We have just 2 minutes left, so I just want to open it up to the whole panel and just ask if you have any final thoughts or tips that you want to share as we wrap up.
I'll say one last thing. So yeah, like, call us like we can talk you through what you're going through. We can help represent. We can maybe help mediate. And also call Chris at HUD if you want to file a complaint. And then final plug for us, I'm always looking for testers. So if you are interested in becoming a tester for us, I think we'll be able to share that information. Yeah, so always looking for.
Great, thanks. Sam, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
yeah. I would just, maybe put in a plug for our organization, Assist. We come at it from a different lens, right? We come at it from the design standpoint and the construction standpoint. And so if anybody's having any difficulties with, any types of housing, whether it be, the construction of housing, or whether it be the design of housing, or if you're just trying to figure out how to, better situate your home or modify your home so that it meets your needs, give us a call. We're always happy to kind of assess everybody's situation, whether we're able to assist you, with the actual construction of it or not. I think we're always open to, giving our advice as architects and built design professionals. And also it's, construction is kind of the construction of housing involves so many different parties that, it's important that I think everybody in the design and the construction process be aware of what kind of accessibility design and construction, what it needs and what it means to individuals. Because, us as architects, we could call out one thing on the drawings, and then just because, possibly a contractor or a subcontractor didn't recognize that was an accessibility requirement that needed to be met, the entire project is then flawed right at that point and doesn't provide the accessibility that's needed. So just reach out to our organization. We're happy to help.
And I'll jump in and second that. I think, the laws on accessibility, reasonable accommodation, disability, and housing, it's both very technical. It's very personal as well. We're talking about, this is people's dwellings. It's the most intimate of things. I mean, it's where they live, where they reside, and it's very personal for people. And I think with that, it's complex. So I would echo what everybody else said. Just contact our organizations. We're here to walk you through it. This is my career is to dedicated to this. And even now I'm still learning things every day. So we want to help. The federal government has resources available along with your local resources here on this panel. So please contact us. There's no bad questions. So if we can't answer, we can get you the right people.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us today and being here and providing us with such great information. We are going to conclude this panel discussion. Ask Me Anything. Thanks again for being here, and I'm sure we will see y'all in future discussions another time. Thank you.